Okay, welcome to Act 1, Scene 1, Part 2. This video follows on from the video with Samson and Gregory and the sexual humour and bantering. Here is the section that we're going to be looking at. And again, what I would suggest you do is you take a couple of minutes to read over this by pausing the video and then picking up again when you've read over it and you're ready to go. Okay, so again, we meet Gregory. And he says he's going to pull a face and let them take it as they want. Now again, this scene is very, very, very dominated with the ideal of male honour and masculine honour and essentially keeping your reputation intact. Samson says, no, that's not enough. It's not enough just to pull a face. I will bite my thumb at them. And if they bear it, if they stand for it, it is a disgrace to them. Now, many of you might not be familiar with what biting your thumb is. Essentially, it's swearing at them. These days, it would be the equivalent of you sticking your middle finger up at somebody. So what Samson's saying is he's going to bite his thumb, and if they bear it, if they don't do anything about it, then we know that they're cowards. We know that they're disgraced. Now, although we're not going to look at it all, you can see there that it engages the other two servants, Abraham and Balthazar, in a bit of dialogue. It engages them in an immature sense of backwards and forwards, toing and froing. Do you bite your thumb at us, sir? I do bite my thumb, sir, but do you bite it at us, sir? And it's very, he said that, I said this. Now what you've got to remember is that we've come to this part in the play when our expectations were so heightened by the prologue. All we've seen on stage so far is stupidity, but this stupidity is deliberately spoken with a high level of formality. Sir, sir, sir. And you hear this word sir repeated time and time and time again throughout this section. The repetition builds an intensity of anger. Each side knows that the other side is being deliberately ironic. They don't really think of each other with that level of respect and formality. So each side knows that the other one essentially is having a laugh at their expense. This therefore would build tension for the audience, but it's also a clear signal that they're mocking their social superiors. We already know from the opening of Act 1 Scene 1 that they don't take the feud very seriously, and this is another example of how the servants in society there not just for providing the audience with a sense of comedy, but also to actually mock those in society who are socially superior and have these values which perhaps aren't based in anything much. So in this case they hold a feud which is a meaningless feud. Nobody knows where it's come from. It's an ancient grudge. It's been around so long nobody can remember why it happened, and the servants are there particularly to mock and show up the nobility. And one of the ways that they do this is by referring to each other as sir, which of course we know that in those days there wouldn't have been. What's also interesting in this section is looking particularly at the features of dialogue. And one of the features of dialogue which mimics spoken language in a sense here is the idea of turn taking. Samson and Abraham are clearly taking turns when they're talking to each other. So one says something, then the other one says something. And this gives them a sense of equality. One isn't more important than the other. It shows that they are facing each other as equal. Again, as I've said before, it's probably worth thinking about why Shakespeare opens such a tragic play where the promise of so much heavy tragedy from the prologue isn't met in the opening. It reverses our expectation in a sense. It gives the audience a reason to carry on watching. They don't want to just have the play open and find out, oh yeah, we learnt in the prologue that they were going to die. Oh yes, they've died. There's got to be light and shade. And I suppose this is a way of providing light-hearted moments for a play which is going to be very dark. It also mocks the obsession that the older, most senior members of the families have for the feud, and I suppose makes it more intense as the tragedy unfolds. This sense of mocking social superiors extends really into the later half of this speech. When Samson asks if the law is on our side, he shows that he clearly cares about the legal implications of his actions, which is something that the senior, more older members of society clearly don't worry about at all. So the fight at the beginning, which you'll come to see in a minute, kicks off between Benvolio and Tybalt and the more senior members of the families. And it's interesting how it's the servants, the lower members of society, who care whether the law is on their side. What's also interesting is that, again, looking at the features of this spoken language and dialogue, how stage directions provide us as much information about the way dialogue creates impressions and the way language creates impressions as much as the words themselves. And we know here that this is spoken as an aside. It's spoken so only the audience really hear it. It's not there for the characters to hear. And it's these two things together which show us really that Samson wants the law to be on his side, but doesn't want the rest of the characters on the stage, doesn't want the opposing families to think that they have that much of a worry about the law being on their side at all. Of course, then the quarrel builds, and this is when we meet Benvolio and Tybalt for the first time. Now, Benvolio is very peacekeeping, and looking at the name Benvolio, it indicates and hints very closely at the word benevolent, which means peaceful and peace-loving. And throughout the play, many people see Benvolio as the peacekeeper. Anyway, he enters and says that the servants and everybody needs to put their swords down. They don't know what they're doing. Have they remembered the violence that has taken place before? Anyway, he beats down their swords. He says he doesn't want anything more to happen in the streets. And Tybalt approaches. This is the first we've ever met Tybalt, and he is outraged. He's outraged more that Benvolio is stopping the fight rather than the fight's taking place in the first place. And he calls them heartless hinds. He calls them cowards. And he turns to Benvolio and he uses the metaphor, look upon thy death. In other words, I'm going to kill you. Benvolio's not interested. He doesn't want to die, of course, but he does just keep the peace. He says, I do but keep the peace. Again, reminding us of this idea of him being benevolent. He says, put your sword down, put up thy sword, or help me to stop the violence that's taking place. And Tybalt, we get an interesting insight into Tybalt's character here when he says, peace, I hate the word, as I hate hell and all Montagues and these. Have it thee, coward. So we learn there that Tybalt is a very angry man, and as we read through the rest of the play, you could perhaps think of him as a catalyst or as a fuse that sparks the violence off. What's also interesting is that we move from this section being in prose to being in blank verse. So when Benvolio enters, the section moves from being in prose to blank verse, and there are a number of reasons for this. Blank verse is more elevated, so it gives more gravity and more status to the situation. It indicates for us as an audience that this bit of the play is more important. The violence that's happening is more tense. Blank verse, so you know, is written in iambic pentameter, but it has no rhyme. But importantly, as we've already said, it would emphasise the importance of the characters and of the situation. Anyway, to recap, I think we should consider these following things. The sort of animalistic imagery that's used and why, the attitude towards women, the proof that male honour is a central theme, etc.